So what we're going to talk about today, I've got four things I just want to go through quickly. Firstly, the bombshell polling that we've had this week and what I think really is significant about it. I want to talk about Labour's definition of Islamophobia. I want to talk about Kemi Badenoch to try and win back reformers. No, you're not sad, Julia, if you're looking forward to this. I look forward to this. The highlight of my week. And I'll say a few words about the new book that I've published this week. Let me start in the polling. Bombshell poll, although I'm looking at Archie because I feel like every week we say bombshell poll, but bombshell poll, Reform 29, Labour 25, Tories 18. I mean, that is a remarkably low number for Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives. It is what I've been talking about for months. So I don't need to spend too long on it because you all know where I am on this. It is further evidence for the realignment of British politics. It is further evidence of reform, picking up the realignment, replacing the Conservatives, and increasingly bearing down on the Labour Party. Look into the detail of the polling. Reform is the most popular party among men. It is the most popular party among the working class. It is winning 1 in 4 Conservative voters from the last election, on top of 1 in 4 people who voted Conservative in 2019. Now, Andrew and somebody else has just made the same point, and it's a point I was going to come to anyway. Yes, the big challenge for reform now is going to be expectation management, because I think, sorry, 1 second. Mel has just made a useful point. Let's lower the camera. I think the problem for reform is, as it's now beginning to move away from the two big parties, the media debate about reform is going to start to change. You know, who is in the shadow cabinet? What is the policy program going to be? How would a reform government tackle issues X, Y, Z? And the nature of that debate is going to change. So I think it's really, really interesting. The other thing to keep in mind, as we confirmed this week and we saw in the news, the local elections in many key reform areas are not going to be held because of the restructuring of local government. That is going to take a bit of momentum, I think, away from reform. They're going to have to find other ways of attracting that attention. The petition that they've got at the moment, which has got, I think, more than 200,000 signatures, will be part of that. And also, of course, the polling and policy announcements. But if you want to get a sense of where we are going, remember the magic number for reform to win a majority is 32.1%. Now, polling 29%, you can see how possible this is going to be. So, polling continuing as we predicted. Secondly, I want to talk about this Labour definition of Islamophobia, which I wrote about this piece, and it got a lot of pickup online. We had a lot of engagement with the piece, and I think that's partly because people can sense what's coming. Now, I did Jordan Peterson's podcast yesterday, which will be out, I guess, in a couple of weeks. Interestingly, the guest before me was Kemi Badenoch. So I don't think she'll be a fan of what I said on that podcast about the future of British conservatism. But Jordan and I had a three-hour conversation about everything from free speech to the rise of reform to the rape gangs. But we also talked about this new definition of Islamophobia. And what I find so chilling about it is that it's based, as I said in my piece, on a report published in 2018 by the All-Parliamentary Party group on Islamophobia, which has come up with this very dubious, very broad, very vague definition, which is going to be used to shut down debate and discussion about Islam in modern Britain. That's the reality of what we're going to see, because Labour will almost certainly adopt this definition, which is already embraced. So, as I said in my piece, the examples of Islamophobia include things like the rape gangs, demographic changes, including the growing numbers of Muslims in Western societies. If you view that as threatening Western ways of life, that's an example of Islamophobia. Talking about so-called entryism into politics, implying that there is an organized effort to influence institutions through sectarian lines, could be seen as an example of Islamophobia. So as I said in the piece, what are we supposed to make of organizations like Muslim Votes, which try to organize 4 million Muslim voters to vote in a particular way, to take a coherent position on policy, or surveys which have shown that about 40% of British Muslims would like a political party for Muslims? Well, if we're debating and we're discussing that, or we're critical of that, is that going to be an example of Islamophobia? So this is why I wanted to write the piece, because in the aftermath of Southport, you might remember we had something called the crackdown on free speech is only just beginning. And I mentioned in that piece that this was going to happen, that you were going to get this big push on Islamophobia, on hate laws, on non-crime hate incidents, because it's the only way the establishment really know how to try and control the public conversation and the supply of information, is by imposing these draconian laws. And what have we seen? We've seen this week, the Home Office leaked document has shown that non-crime hate incidents are going to be expanded. Jordan and I had a very long conversation about those, because Canadians, they just can't get their head around it. As I said, a non-crime hate incident would be one of you, after this live, calling up the police and saying, well, please don't do this, by the way. Matt Goodwin said something offensive about one of my protected characteristics, whether it's, gender, race, sexual orientation, or whatever. And you do not even need to give the police evidence of that perceived insult or offense. And a black mark is then logged against my name that could be made available to an employer when or if I go for a position, and they will be told that Matt has non-crime hate incidents next to his name. Now, I am sure I have many non-crime hate incidents next to my name. And as Jordan Peterson said to me yesterday, he would take it as a badge of honor if there were 1 or 200 non-crime hate incidents listed on his record. But it is also incredibly serious, because the use of hate laws, and even the use of terms like far right and Islamophobia, are being used in subtle ways to narrow the range of acceptable discourse. That's what's going on here. So it's about narrowing the range of acceptable discourse when it comes to issues like migration, diversity, and multiculturalism, which is why we have to push back against it. It's why my view is that we should not have hate laws. My view is that we should abolish non-crime hate incidents. That it's not because I want people running around the streets saying terrible things. It's simply that I don't think this is at all reflective of our history of individual liberty and freedom. And in my mind, the key tension in Western societies today is this: you either prioritize free speech and free expression, or you sacrifice free speech and free expression on the altar of protecting minority groups from perceived harm. That's the key fault line. On one side are conservatives, classical liberals, freedom fighters, who say, look, I don't really care if somebody's offended. I live in a free society where people should be able to say whatever they want freely. On the other side are the controllers, the authoritarians, who say actually all of those things should be subordinated in order to prioritize protecting racial, sexual, and gender minorities from any perceived harm and offense. And that is social justice, or woke ideology 101. That's why it is illiberal. It's why it's authoritarian. It's why it doesn't have any place in a modern free society. Because as you see with everything from the hate laws to university campus and so on, it will always subordinate the things we care about in the name of protecting minorities from emotional harm. So this definition really does matter. I also wanted to talk about today Kemi Badenoch's new policy announcement yesterday on immigration policy, because what she's announced is a good idea, that we should not grant migrants arriving in the UK who are here for a few years what's called the indefinite right to remain in the country. So what happens at the moment is if you're here for 5 years, you get the indefinite right to stay in the UK forever. Okay, essentially. Now, that has generated considerable alarm because the Boris wave of migration, remember the big explosion in immigration that happened really since Boris Johnson, Priti Patel, and the COVID pandemic, because we've allowed 3 to 4 million people into the country, most of whom are low skill, low wage, well, they are going to become eligible for indefinite leave to remain in the next few years, which means they and their relatives can stay forever. And as we've already shown on the Substack, the kind of migration we have in the UK at the moment is a net fiscal cost. It's a drag on the economy. It's undermining prosperity. So why would you allow people who are not net fiscal contributors to stay in the country, right? That's the argument. It doesn't really make sense. You should only be able to stay in the UK if you're contributing, right? And to her credit, Kemi Badenoch has come out and said, look, this is a really important issue. I don't think if you're reliant on social housing, I don't think if you've broken our laws, if you're a criminal, and I don't think, if you've claimed benefits, I don't think you should be entitled to indefinite leave to remain. And that is fundamentally one of the big problems that she's trying to overcome. Now, the question, as I talked about last night on the show, is whether people will ever be able to trust the Tories on immigration, whether they will actually believe in what Kemi Badenoch is saying, whether they believe that the Tory parliamentary party can ever be credible on that issue, because what the Conservatives did in office was shocking. And the two examples I used last night on the show are particularly egregious. So just consider these numbers. In the second half of 2024, as a country, we issued 15,000 visas to health and social care workers for migrants to come in and work in our health and social care system. 15,000, 1-5. We issued 60,000 visas to their relatives. 15,000 for workers, 60,000 for relatives, okay? If you zoom in even more, as my colleague Carl Williams has done at the Centre for Policy Studies, we gave 1,000 visas to people from Zimbabwe to work in the health and social care system, okay, 1,000. We gave 10,000 visas to their relatives. In other words, the dependency ratio is 10 to 1, right? So, well, why does that matter? You might say, well, it matters because 9 of those 10 people are not coming into work. They're not coming in to, drive up productivity, drive up economic growth. They're often here to live in housing, use public services, maybe state benefits, maybe work in low skill, low wage jobs, which depresses productivity and GDP per capita. It's great for big business. It's not great for British taxpayers and the wider economy. And this is basically a reflection of the insanity that the Conservative Party really imposed on the rest of the country. So Kemi Badenoch, to her credit, is trying to say, look, this is bananas. It doesn't make sense. We need to change it. Her problem, though, as Reform pointed out yesterday in their counter-attack on that, is that her party will now forever be known as the mass immigration political party, right? It was the Uniparty, the Tories and Labour, who presided over mass migration. Are they ever going to be seen to be credible? Personally, I don't think so. My view. I just think there's such a busted brand. That's why they're on 18% in the polls. The other question I would ask Kemi Badenoch is, what do you do? I'm assuming her policy is about going forward. Were the Conservatives to win the next election in 2029? I mean, I would eat my current book if that was going to happen. It's not going to happen. But is she talking about the numbers of people going forward, or is she also talking about the millions of people who have come in over the last few years? So we don't really have answers to that, but it's definitely one to watch. I also made this point, and I should have mentioned this when discussing reform. I made this point in County Durham last weekend when I drove up to Sunderland to speak at the Reform Northeast conference, where they had 1,200 people in a traditional Labour area, utterly fed up with mass immigration, utterly fed up with the two main parties. And I have to say, something's going on in the northeast of England, because the energy was absolutely insane. Everybody was really energetic. I looked at the numbers in the northeast. There's about 10 seats up there that I think could easily fall from Labour to Reform. And we put some of this out in a Telegraph this week, showing all of the seats across Northern England that are likely to fall if the current direction of travel continues. And I do think, look, obviously a lot can change in politics, but I do think a massive part of the Red Wall, the industrial heartlands in Northern England and Wales, are going to fall to Reform. I think all of those seats will end up going. The last thing I wanted to mention before coming to your questions, and I know Archie is pulling your questions together. Also this week, I published this new book, Bad Education. I don't want to say too much about it because I've already told you about it on the stack, but it's basically telling you from the inside what is going fundamentally wrong in our universities and on campus. And having spent 20 years of teaching, working, writing, serving universities in this country, I wanted to just finish that experience with a book that is very candid and honest about all the things that I think are going wrong. And some of the examples in the book, I think you'll find pretty shocking about what happened when I tried to bring in external speakers onto campus, what happened in terms of the hypocrisy at some of our elite institutions. They love China, but on the one hand, they're very damning of people who hold different viewpoints. And it was really it's probably the most personal book I've written, because it was a sort of goodbye to the institutions that I'd worked in essentially for 20 years. And I guess for me, the Substack and the work that we're doing, the campaigning work, the public debate work, the national conversation work has replaced that. So, the book is really about closing one chapter, and obviously we're all in this new chapter together. But if you get a chance to read it, do have a look. Now, I'm just going to get to some of your questions. So we've got quite a few. So the Martyrs asked, so why are Reform polling lower with women than men? What can Reform do about that? So if you look at all anti-establishment parties across Europe, most of them do better among men than women. If you look at what's going to happen in Germany later this month at the election, the AfD is much stronger among men than women. And generally that's the case. Interestingly, Trump doesn't really have this divide. Lots of reasons for that. It's called the gender gap. Women, the argument being that women are generally, and I'm making sweeping generalizations here, but are more focused on themes around fairness, are more focused on themes around sort of tolerance and empathy. And when you have national populist parties, they tend not to be as appealing to women. They also focus very strongly on the working class, on typically men who have been smashed apart by globalization and mass immigration. But I do think, by the way, that there is an important point that lies behind this with Reform, which is they are going to need to, my personal view would be, challenging the image of the party as a boys' club. Because if they can broaden it out and they can push forward more women, younger people, and so on, and if you go to the events, you'll see a lot of women and young people speaking at them. I think if they can do that at the national level, I think that will make a really big difference. Tenaciously Turfin says the rape gang scandal is losing traction. Please keep this going. The Labour Party has a lot to answer for. Yes, to some extent, I think it is losing traction. But at the same time, I think the grooming gang, rape gang scandal has now become so embedded in the public mindset that the culture and the debate has been fundamentally, permanently changed. We had some polling, I think last week or the week before, showing that the vast majority of British voters have heard about the rape gang scandal and have been following it closely. Now, prior to this debate, prior to Elon Musk, prior to us kind of, discussing it on social media, you would never have seen numbers like that. It was a fairly fringe issue that people were not willing to talk about. We also have a number of ongoing cases. If you're following people, Charlie Peters as an example, whenever we will always share stuff that's related to it. We have a number of ongoing court cases that will continue to draw attention to it. The call for a national inquiry will continue to be made. I think it will almost certainly feature as a debate point at every election going forward. The first time there's a by-election in a northern Labour seat, it will be an issue. It will be talked about. So I think it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Andrew says, do you think polls like this will become a runaway train? Yes, I think my working assumption has been that Reform will become embedded as the number one political party in the polls. That's my assumption. But again, as I say, that's going to come with some enormous challenges around expectation management and how you maintain momentum. So if you look at the literature on the research on how do you build a successful party, it often says there are two phases. There's a breakthrough period, where you're doing well in the polls, you're winning by-elections, you're winning whatever. But then there's a consolidation period. And the consolidation period is when you want to get good people around you, you want to have a coherent program, you want to be rooted in a clear philosophy, etc., etc. I think Reform over the next year are going to be morphing from breakthrough to consolidation. And it's going to be that evolution that I think will be fundamentally central to how the party ends up performing in 2028, 29. Can it manage that transition as well as it needs to? Christina says, why aren't work visas temporary? Say 5 years max, no family visas. So there's a number of things, Christina, that could be done. We could increase the period where you're eligible to apply for indefinite leave to remain all the way to 15 years. We could dramatically reduce dependence. We could increase the salary threshold. We could have a cap on migration. We could have an immediate freeze on all non-essential migration, as in migration that does not directly contribute to supporting the National Health Service and perhaps social care. We need a radical overhaul of the entire system. I don't need to tell people on this call that. And we also need to overhaul the skill-based system. So I've said this before, but of 2 to 4 million people that have come in recent years, the percentage who are coming in on worker visas is 22%. That is an outrage. It's ridiculous. This is not a skill-based policy. Boris Johnson said we'd get an Australia-style policy. That's bananas. Absolutely ridiculous. We've got a low skill, the taps are on and nobody's doing anything about it. So we need to radically reform that skill-based policy. Richard, great question as well. What is the floor for the Tories in the polls? I mean, Richard, I don't know. I mean, 18%. I never thought I'd see the Conservatives down on these sort of numbers. I mean, it used to be said, prior to Brexit, pollsters used to say the floor for the Tories was 30%, that they would never fall below 30. Now, obviously, at the election last year, I think they polled 23%, which is remarkable, only attracting 23% of all voters. 18% is low. They're underperforming. Kemi Badenoch is underperforming relative to what the party polled at the 24 general election. They're getting squeezed because what's happening is Reform are increasing their share of Brexit voters, which is up to about 46% of Brexit voters are going Reform. And because those voters are more pro-Conservative, because the Conservatives hoovered up Brexit voters and reshaped themselves around Brexit voters after the referendum, that was Theresa May and then Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson got 75% of Brexit voters. So because Farage is now eating into that Brexit vote, he's hammering the Conservative electorate, which is why Reform would do well to make mass immigration the next Brexit. That's what they should do, because that blows apart the Conservative electorate, but it also cuts across the Labour electorate as well, because about 20 to 35% of Labour voters are also immigration skeptics. So that's the potential for this, in which case, Richard, the floor could be lower than 18%. I think we've got some other questions coming in from Archie. Neil, also in reply to your question, I've started wearing specs because when you're reading an auto cue the other side of the studio, it's impossible to read unless you've got laser-like vision. John Marr, says, basically, who is going to halt the demographic changes in this country if this is not addressed? And over time, we're going to see some fundamental changes. Yes, I agree with you. I think there are two things that need to be done. Firstly, the immigration system needs to be completely overhauled and levels of migration need to be dramatically lowered. But we also, at the same time, need to deal with our fertility crisis and the fact that we are having too few children as a country. Our birth rate is currently about 1.6 and it's going to fall to about 1.3 by the end of this century. So no one in Westminster is talking about this, but the two are intimately related. So if you look at all of the projections going forward, immigration is the only driver of the UK's population growth. The only driver, because more British people are dying than being born each year. Okay, so the answer to the question is, aside from dramatically overhauling mass immigration, making it high skill from culturally compatible nations in Europe, dramatically slashing what we currently have, you also then need to start putting into place cultural changes and policy changes that are basically going to be encouraging the native population to have more kids. That's basically what needs to happen. So if you don't want endless, forever mass uncontrolled migration and a dwindling economy, we're also going to have to basically figure out our version of what Israel has done. Israel is the only country that has basically bucked the fertility collapse that has taken place across the West. How has Israel done that? I mean, Poland and Hungary have experimented with it, but they haven't managed yet to find the right answer to it. How has Israel done it? Israel's done it by appealing basically to an existential sense of security, which is it's everybody's responsibility and duty to have more children, and the state will actively support and encourage people to do that. These are debates, to be frank, we have to get into as a country, as a society, but nobody in Westminster is even talking about what might pro-family policy look like beyond tinkering a little bit here and there with the tax changes. The good news in terms of for people who want to fix all of this is that the support is there to do it. As I keep pointing out, 70, 80% plus of people in Britain want to lower migration. They want governments that are supportive of family formation. They want things like a principle of national preference put into things like housing, the economy, foreign aid. The big debate in the US this week around US aid, Elon Musk, Marco Rubio and others slashing aid, going to countries elsewhere in the world, redirecting it into things that that reflect the national interest. we're going to be writing about this next week. One of the things I've asked the team to do is draw up all of the projects that we are spending money on in other countries. And I can tell you some of the projects that are part of the £15.3 billion that we spend on foreign aid every year. Some of the projects that we found are insane. Really crazy amounts of money that are going on, utterly ridiculous initiatives, often in developed countries, in countries that have nuclear programs or they're in space. And yet we've got British people being treated in hospital corridors and car parks, and we're giving hundreds of thousands and millions of pounds to these projects overseas. So we're going to be opening up another flank in the Substack that's going to be specifically focused on foreign aid and how we can radically change the way we allocate foreign aid and how we can save some of that money and redirect it into British institutions and the British people. Because as I said in County Durham last weekend, my personal motto is fix Britain before helping the world, right? Fix Britain before helping the world. If we have people dying in hospital corridors and they don't have the decency of privacy to be with their loved ones in their final moments, then why the hell are we giving £15 billion to the likes of India and even China? It's insane. So we need to change that. Just coming up to a few comments. Richard says, Matt, given your argument in bad education, which I know is correct, as a former legal academic of 22 years service, what can be done to save the universities from all of this wokery? Have they been totally captured? Well, Richard, if you've got to the final chapter of the book, you'll know exactly what I think we should do. And that's basically my manifesto for saving the universities in the future. I lay out a specific policy program and a legal requirement for universities to sign up to things like the Chicago Principles. I want the Higher Education Free Speech Act brought back in. I don't want it to be defanged, which is what the Labour Party are doing. I want a legal duty on universities to protect and promote free speech, and if they don't, they should be fined. I want to intervene in the institutions, in other words, to correct these institutions. A good friend of mine, Eric Kaufman, has often made the argument that the state would intervene if a police force was corrupt. The state would intervene if a school was no longer performing. So there is no reason why the state should not intervene to fix the universities and to level the playing field. One of the reviews this week in the Financial Times, which is great because this is like, the paper of the elite class, was by none other than David Willits. And he was a guy who's like completely committed to everything the universities have been about for the last 30, 40 years. The massive expansion of higher education, the dumbing down of standards, the growing reliance on international students, often at the expense of British kids. And even he actually conceded in his review that, there's probably enough evidence here to make the case that we have a problem on campus. So even though the rest of the review was negative, I took that as a personal win. Valerie says, I agree. We need more people, more women standing in political parties like Reform. Strawhead says, how will the USA scandal affect the media landscape in the UK? As I've just said, I think we need to use it to get a debate going about foreign aid here in this country. Cat Mint says, will we see you at the Reform rally on March the 28th? Of course you will. I will be speaking in Birmingham. We've got 10,000 people coming. It's going to be the biggest political rally in modern British politics. I will be there, and I expect to see some of you there. I'm also going to be going around the country over the next couple of months. I'm looking at Archie, but we've got Bromley, Cornwall. We're up in the northwest. We're doing stuff up there. Shropshire, Derbyshire. We're going to be in Wales. We're going back to Llanelli, which is where my family are from originally, or half my family. So it's going to be a busy three or 4 months, that's for sure. Michelle, interesting question here. Is the UK going to become the next Sweden. Michelle may have watched, I don't know if you did, but you may have watched the show this week where we talked about the bombings in Sweden. And if you have not got on top of this story, you really need to know. I mean, this is remarkable that this has not been on the front page of more newspapers around the world since Christmas, as in just, 5-6 weeks ago. There have been 30 bombings in Sweden. 30 bombings in Sweden, mainly by immigrant gangs of drug dealers and criminals throwing grenades around, blowing up apartment buildings. There's just been a high-profile assassination of an anti-Islam activist in Sweden. And something's going fundamentally wrong in a country that used to be held up as the beacon of liberal values, tolerance, was what I would say fanatically supportive of diversity and immigration. And we had a guy on the show, Ivar Arpi, really sound guy, really great guy, who explained to us basically what has happened. And the consensus, the pro-immigration consensus, has completely broken down in Sweden. Everybody is now skeptical of what this policy has done to Swedish society. Nobody can avoid the problems. He's basically saying, look, I mean, things are going to get worse before they get better, unless they, dramatically change things. Are we heading in the same direction? Michelle asked. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm skeptical. I'm very dubious. We know that migration is driving crime. We have the Freedom of Information request data that shows that. We know that knife crime is becoming a massive problem. We know that we've got a problem with radical Islamism in this country, about 40,000 jihadis in the UK. We know we have a problem with integration and a model of multiculturalism that isn't working. We know we have the beginnings of what you might call communalism in some parts of the UK, where you've had one ethnic group fighting with another ethnic group in places like Leicester and Hare Hills. And I'm not, touch wood. We all want to hope this isn't the case, but my concern is we are increasingly entering into what the Harvard professor Robert Putnam warned about 15 years ago, when he said that countries which tend to experience rapid demographic change become low trust societies where people hunker down, turn away from one another, and increasingly wonder what it is that's holding them together. And I think these issues are only going to become more important to ordinary British people. I think people are going to want a serious political response to them, that is going to be radical, that is going to be challenging of the elite consensus. And I think we all want to play a part in supporting that and helping that. Petronella is saying essentially, how can reform break past the racist tag? I think that's already happening. I don't think those attacks are really working anymore. If you watch PMQs on Wednesday, there was a really interesting exchange. A Labour MP targeted reform on the NHS, which I think I took as a sign that they're not going to be using the kind of racist attack line on reform. They're going to be using reform will privatise the National Health Service, which, by the way, is bananas. That won't happen. What reform are saying is the NHS is clearly not working, and why are we spending £90 billion a year on something that is clearly not working? We need to radically overhaul the entire system. That, to me, is common sense. What we've got in this country is a national religion whereby you cannot question an institution that is visibly failing on every metric. Almost, it is failing to look after the British people. And I don't know about you, but I found the whole notion of us standing outside banging pots and pans and not asking tougher questions about what is happening in the NHS. To me, that was a really important moment. And the martyr, just as we come towards the end, how long will Rachel Reeves last? Lord David Frost tore her to shreds in the Daily Telegraph today. I've not read David's piece, but I will, because he's incredibly sharp writer, politician, commentator, and I'm not surprised that he's torn Rachel Reeves to shreds. Yeah, I don't think she's going to last long at all. Her ratings are -35. She's lost confidence of the city. She's lost confidence of big business. She clearly has no idea whatsoever about how to drive growth. She came into the job telling everybody to get real, being very gloomy about the economy, and now she's decided we should all be optimistic about the economy. She almost lost control when the yield spiked above 5% a month or so ago, and I think we're going to be tested like that in a much bigger way. In fact, last night I had Philip Allman on the show. If you get a chance, it's worth going back and watching that, because it's the final quarter of the show. What he was saying is, look, unless we get our hands around quantitative easing and the amount of money that we've been printing and the amount of debt that we have and just how vulnerable we are to the changes in the costs of that debt, what Philip was saying is we are on the cusp of a financial crisis that will be bigger than the great financial crash of 2009 and 2010. And I think, I'm not an economist, but I can see from, his work, Liam Halligan's work, people I respect, they are all saying that if we don't change course radically, we're going to have some really, really big problems.
Matt, just to let you know, a new MRP poll just came out. Right?
So I'm just being told by Archie here that we actually have a new MRP poll, which has come out with, who did the poll, do you know?
I think it's Electoral Calculus.
Electoral Calculus, which has Reform, number one, 175 seats, Conservatives close second, 23%, 178 seats, so basically neck and neck. Labour, 174 seats, Liberals, 57. So that would be a Conservative Reform coalition of some description. So it's a near three-way tie. So yeah, it would be a Conservative Reform coalition, with Reform winning almost all of Wales, the northeast and northern seats. I mean, wow. Isn't this next election going to be absolutely fascinating? I mean, we're sat here and look at the polls that are breaking as we're having this conversation. So there's so much to get into, and there's so much to talk about. We, as always, talk to you first about these issues. We're going to keep getting lots of good content out there. There's going to be a piece coming later today. The show's on tonight, 8 until 9 p.m. We've got so much stuff in the pipeline to come out on all of these issues. I just think between us, I want to do a lot more I want to start doing more on net zero. I want to do more on the farming situation, what's happening in rural communities. I want to do more on how we reform the state, the economy. I really want to open up some of these other flanks. And as I say, we've got this data set. We just built this data set from scratch on foreign aid, where all the money's going, and we're going to start highlighting in a number of pieces over the next week the insanity of what we're spending money on. And I think the thing we've got lined up next week is going to be really, really great. So thank you for joining. Thank you for your support. I'm going to call it there today because I've got a 1 o'clock meeting with the editorial team at GB to figure out what we're talking about tonight. But as always, thank you for your support. I hope you're well. I hope everybody in your life is well. And I will see you here next week. Obviously, I see you on the stack as well. But thank you for tuning in, and catch you soon. Bye-bye.